It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. Joining me on the show today is Emmet Blackwell, a strategic town planner from Western Australia and an experienced DIY tiny houser who over the years has built and lived in tiny houses in the Byron Bay Hinterland of New South Wales, as well as renting out his tiny house on Airbnb for some extra income. Today he's still small space living on his own 40-acre property in Western Australia with his wife and currently living in a donga, which, if you're not familiar, is a portable cabin of sorts, whilst working slowly on another tiny house on the side. In this episode, we talk about some of the challenges of building and living in a tiny house, how Emmet was able to easily find a parking space for his tiny home in Byron Bay, including how he got around 30 offers in 48 hours. Yes, you heard that correctly. We also talk about the eco-community experiment in Victoria that Emmet was a part of and why living in a community may not be for him. We touch on Australian Tiny House Council regulations and building codes, the composting toilet setup that Emmet used, and lots more. Now let's go chat with Emmet. Hey Emmet, welcome to Tiny House Conversations and thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Beautiful. So, a few years ago, you were living in a tiny home on a 40-acre organic farm in the Byron Bay Hinterland in New South Wales. And since then, you've relocated to Western Australia and you've now got your own 40-acre rural property. And what I'd love to do today is take things back to your tiny home experience in Byron Bay. And then we'll move into how you're living now, talk about the tiny home that you're currently building and, see what you're up to with your plans for, different projects on your land. Let's start with your story. Can you share with us a little bit about what inspired you to start your tiny house journey?
Okay, a bit of a background, I guess. I studied urban and regional planning at uni. I kind of had the pressure to go to university and for some reason I chose urban and regional planning and became a town planner. And I think, I've always had an interest in social and environmental justice issues. So that led me down that path in study. And I was probably a bit naive thinking town planners can have a positive influence on the world, change the world, that kind of thing. So I always had those environmental and social values sitting in the background and driving me professionally as well as in my personal life. I think I became quite jaded and bitter just about, I guess, the situation of the system we're in with property and real estate and the amount of money. And I didn't want to be a wage slave. And I was kind of, I went to university, I got a job, I was ticking those boxes. All of my friends were getting married and buying houses. We're talking $500,000 houses and mortgages that last a lifetime. And I saw a picture, a book on tiny houses, maybe 10, 12 years ago now. It was one of Lloyd Kahn's books. And it had a selection of different tiny houses, some on boats, in trees, earthen tiny houses. And one section happened to be tiny houses on wheels. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a tiny house on wheels before. And it just blew my mind that you could essentially own it. It separated land and home ownership. So you could own your own home, but not be in a world of debt. I would have been in my late 20s by that stage, or mid 20s by the time I saw that, and something just popped. And I went on a bit of a journey, I guess. Like, I'm not a tradesman, I'm not qualified or trained formally with building or carpentry, but I got to a point where I walked away from a local government job I'd been in for 5 years in the city in Perth, and I paid to go to a natural building course over east in Victoria. I had some friends in Victoria and started spending a bit of time in Melbourne and the surrounding areas. And I guess it's just more of a critical mass over there of people thinking alternatively, doing things differently. So there's more opportunities. Being from Perth and WA, we're the most isolated city in the world. So it was great for me to just get on the East Coast and explore some of those social networks around the natural building scene. And I think I knew, because I didn't own land at that point, that an inroad to dabbling with some building and trying to own my own home, or just some housing security and flexibility that a tiny house on wheels has come to represent, meant that I started, hang out with people who were building earthships and cob houses and earth bag, adobe, and a lot of different natural building techniques. But I think I knew that I wanted to learn enough carpentry skills to build my own tiny house on wheels. That seemed like an achievable goal without, the mortgage and stuff like that. I did it really low cost, working on a bunch of projects for other people's tiny houses or at eco villages for free without getting paid, and that kind of flowed on from the natural building course I had paid for and then the networks that opened up. From there, I found myself living on an eco village, a bit of a social experiment in Gippsland for 2 years, and I had an opportunity to build my own tiny house on wheels with recycled materials. I was very fortunate that I was living with very little money for that time and was able to devote a lot of labour and time. So that's, there's a lot of privilege in my ability to kind of take some time out from the office life that I'd previously known and just pursue learning carpentry and then putting it into practice, and still learning at the same time as I built my house. And we ran that as a workshop. I had people coming and learning and helping build my house. We kind of ran that at low cost and had people camping out in Gippsland for 5 days. And I had some friends from that network of natural builders who were qualified carpenters who kind of helped me run the show and piece that together. And we got it to kind of, we got the frame up and started cladding the outside and preparing windows. And then I just kind of finished it off over about a year out on that farm in Gippsland. And once I'd finished, I was pretty sick of the cold because it was a lot colder there than I'm used to in Perth. So I headed up the east coast and went north, basically went straight up to the Byron hinterland. I did stop along the way at a few places where I had friends. And just really enjoyed living in my tiny house. I basically finished it and then went north, ran a few workshops on the way on tiny houses in Melbourne, Sydney, and then got to Byron and just enjoyed living in it. Ran a workshop eventually in Byron and just did odd jobs, a bit of carpentry work, a bit of lots of different things. I had that flexibility to kind of just tap in and out of casual roles. And then eventually I got to a point where I'd been on a few different properties, beautiful properties in the Byron area. I'd kind of figured out how to just look online using Facebook and stuff for land, and a cute picture of a tiny house goes a long way. And I ended up on a property where I was able to actually rent it out on Airbnb, and I'd be staying in my camper van or in a tent while I was renting out my house. And that gave me enough money to kind of make ends meet. And I had a good agreement with the landowner there who, I think I was paying a certain amount per week to be there, even if I didn't have any rentals in the tiny house. And then the owner got a 25% share of the total Airbnb payments. And, I did all the management and cleaning for that Airbnb business. But it worked really well and people loved it. And for me, it was about sharing some of the, I guess, environmental messages and giving people an experience, a positive experience of a more simple way of life with a really small footprint, because we're talking kind of compost toilet, off-grid solar system in the back paddock of a farm that wasn't being used at the time. So it was nice to share that with people, but that also funded my basic needs for petrol and food and paying, my rent on that farm to keep everyone happy. And I had a really good relationship with the landowner, which was fortunate. He was a lovely guy. So that's kind of the journey up until I'd arrived in Byron Bay, and just really enjoyed living in the house, taking a bit of time out, doing odd jobs and getting the Airbnb up and cranking. I think I did 2 summers worth, and it was a really nice experience. And that gave me the flexibility to eventually, I got offered the opportunity to tour guide up in Kakadu. I'd never even been to the Northern Territory. It was just a mutual friend who'd done it for a long time and had contacts, and thought, you'd be able to kind of do that. Your personality is suited, and, I'm an outdoorsy person. So I went up tour guiding in the top end in the Northern Territory, doing 4 and 5 day fall drive tours that involved a lot of nature and Indigenous culture. That was fantastic. And I met my partner up there, who I'm with now, Lyndall. And so that, I guess, ended my time in Byron Bay. And I dipped back into town planning just to be up there because tour guiding seasonal work, and it also means I'm on the road 5 or 6 days a week. So I'd moved up there to be with my new partner, Lyndall. She was a high school teacher up there in Darwin, and that led me back into some town planning work for a while for the NT government, actually. But it was just to kind of, make it work and be up there for a while. I was fortunate to be in a safe government job in a planning department for the territory government up there, and that meant that I could actually buy a cheap bit of land. I didn't look terrible to the banks at that stage. If I'm sure if I applied for a mortgage while renting my Airbnb tiny house, it wouldn't have gone too well. But Lyndall and I were fortunate to be in a position that we were able to grab a 40-acre property. We bought it really quickly because properties were starting to fly off the shelf, especially in regional areas close to the coast. And it's quite an isolated area. There's not a whole lot going on apart from national parks and four-wheel drive tracks and beaches, but that's why we're there. We really love it. Yeah, my tiny house is actually still on the farm in Byron Bay, and that farm's up for sale at the moment. I'm going to be looking to get it back here as soon as I can, but that's quite challenging because obviously the borders have been quite tough in Western Australia. Yeah. So, we'll see what happens in terms of timing of getting that tiny house over here. But in the meantime, over the last few years, I've slowly been chipping away on another tiny house, but that's been hard to get much traction because I'm now working, back a full-time kind of government planning job, which it's really good. And there's opportunities where I can plant seeds and do positive things in terms of tiny houses and environmental change. But it means my time's taken up with just the 9 till 5 at the moment. So that's what I'll be doing for a while. And hopefully that's, do a stint for a number of years and then get back into more building tiny houses and probably doing some ecotourism stuff down here to give people, valuable experiences in tiny house living and environmental consciousness. And that's kind of where we want to take things back to. I guess I tested the waters with the one tiny house in Byron, and now we've got our own property. We can kind of scale things up a little bit, and got a few things planned and on the boil, but it's just going to it's the long game, I guess. It might take us a few years to get all of that stuff set up.
Yeah. Amazing. Wow. You've had such an interesting journey. And I loved hearing all of that. And there's so many directions I'd love to go, but I'd first love to just know, you mentioned how you were living in that eco-community experiment down in Victoria. And I actually watched that documentary, this Simpler Way, I think it's called. Is that right? That's right. Documented that. Yeah. And I would just love to know from you, because that's something that I feel at some point in the future would love to work towards. And I know that a lot of other people, especially with everything that's going on now in the world, having that kind of interest of going tiny or moving on to land, but also being able to be around, other like-minded people. So what was that experience like for you living amongst community, especially maybe with some people that you didn't know initially?
Well, I didn't know anyone initially who was living on that project. So I kind of rocked up cold and got to know people. There were some links in my network through natural building in Victoria to that group of people, but everyone was fresh, and that was a really unique, I guess, social experiment, because we're essentially living in an eco-village and building different forms of tiny homes and living quite simply. But we hadn't bought in, we hadn't, paid money to buy a share on an eco-village. It was known that this was probably only a 12-month project, and it ended up kind of blowing out to about 2 years. But some people left before the 12 months were up and others stayed. I think I was one of the longest people there, and the tiny house project I was working on kind of kept me busy and kept me there. It was a fantastic experience, really profound, really intense. There were some people that I'm really great friends with now and have made lifelong connections, and there's other people I probably didn't get along with as well. And I think it's representative of all kind of human relations or communities. It was certainly a boiling pot of passionate people, and I'm really proud that I took part in that project. I think I learnt a lot about community and communication, and I guess I've established where I think my boundaries are in terms of wanting independence or privacy, time alone versus time in community. And I think there's value in both, and everyone's balance is different. And I think it's a really tricky thing to make work. You know, most intentional communities, even if it's with your friends or your family, most of them don't last. It's really hard to balance that social dynamic. Everyone's got different expectations. People go through phases in their lives. They go through illness, mental illness, and navigating all of that as a community is difficult. So for me personally, I don't know if community life is for me. I did have a 3-month stint on another intentional community, which was permanent, where people had bought in, and that was on the East Coast between Sydney and Byron. And that was also fascinating. I kind of stuck around for 3 months, I think it was, and actually went to some of the community meetings and got a taste of what living in an intentional community more permanently might be like, and some of the social dynamics and history of that particular community. And that was really fascinating. And I enjoyed my time there. But, you know, I experienced conflict and complex histories, and people come and go, even just in the 3 months that I was there. Again, I made some really amazing connections and probably lifelong friendships. And it's nice to be able to go back to a place like that. And I think that's where, for me, the tiny house on wheels was really empowering, because at the end of the day, if I parked up in someone's community or backyard or farm, I was there to kind of make the most of it and have a crack. But if things turned sour, or they had to sell the land, or things change, I had that flexibility to very easily and cheaply up stumps and drive off down the road. And I'd got to a point where I was confident enough I'd be able to find somewhere, even if it had to be a friend's driveway for a while, you know, like that's worst case scenario. But I like that flexibility. If you're buying into a community or buying land with other people, you're really locking in, and you want to be 110% that everyone's on the same page, and you've got those governance and communication structures in place that are robust, that can actually deal with conflict arising or complex decision making as a group, because that's really challenging. That's one of the hardest bits, I think. And yeah, I'm very, very lucky to have been able to purchase some rural land myself with my partner. We did get it incredibly cheap, and that's probably because it's in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by national park, and you know, it's a long way to drive to towns or to employment centres. But that's a trade-off we've made, and I'm really thankful for that. And it's not possible for everyone. I realise that, but I've got a lot of privilege that has allowed me to kind of take the path I have. So I'm very fortunate that we've got a bit more stability and certainty, and we know we can invest not only in structures that are on wheels, but on more permanent building projects and, you know, gardening and regeneration and things like that are more permanent, and I guess offer another level of resilience in these crazy times that we're living in.
Yeah. So I think it's really great that you've had that experience of living in a community, and then also contrasting that to having your own tiny home in Byron, and then now, you know, having such a big amount of land really remotely away from a lot of things, and just experiencing all of it and finding what works for you. I know for me, in terms of, you know, being around community and also needing my own space, is definitely, like you say, such a balance. And I can imagine that, just like, and I think you mentioned this before too, just like all relationships, you know, even if you are on the same page, or you have similar values and belief systems and those types of things, that there's always going to be, you know, different ways of being and different ways of doing things and different perspectives and all of that I can imagine, you know, will bring up conflict from time to time. And maybe for some people just might not be something that they want to be a part of or to deal with on a regular basis. So I think that's really interesting. And I did remember when I was watching the documentary, that was something that came up about the challenges of being in community. So I think that, yeah, I think it's got its, you know, there's both sides of the story, isn't there? And it depends on really how you want to live and what you want to do and all of that. So yeah, it's really cool to hear that. And I would also just love to know, just with your taking it back to your Byron Bay tiny home for a minute, what was the size of that home?
It was 4.2 meters long, and I think probably 2.3 meters wide on the floor. and I think 2.5 at its maximum width, which is kind of the legal restriction in Australia. I didn't have a loft. I didn't have a bathroom inside the house. I set up a separate bathhouse and compost toilet. So, yeah, it was really just a bedroom with a little kitchen on one wall and a potbelly stove, a little couch, and an old locker as a wardrobe. So definitely on the smaller end of the scale in terms of, what you usually see on the internet. But in a warmer climate like Byron Bay, it was easy to get away with if I have to set up an outdoor shower or use a very simple compost toilet that might be exposed to the elements because I've been moving around, which I had that experience a few times. Yeah, it'd be a lot harder if you are based in Victoria or Tasmania or, somewhere in Europe or America where you're copping really cold weather. So, I guess, the warmer climate here in Australia definitely kind of makes it easier to really strip it back to the bare essentials and still be comfortable.
Yeah, because I guess it's very much, I see this very commonly with a lot of tiny houses is, you have a lot of people have a deck and then they build things around. And so you kind of bring the outside in and you're kind of almost forced to be outside more and be in nature more and that kind of thing. So, 4 meters, it's a smaller one, but I feel like for myself, I could probably make it work. It might not be for everyone, but I could see how it would also serve a purpose at a time. So you mentioned that you are off the grid and that you have had a composting toilet. What kind of setup did you have? How did you, so I know there's different ways to do things, like there's different actual composting toilets and then people do like a bucket system type deal, or what did you do?
So when I first built the house and headed north to the Byron area, I started really simple with a 20-litre fisherman's bucket, which is like what they talk about, I think, in the Human Manure Handbook, which is a great resource. I saw you shared that recently and that you've got a copy.
Yes.
So, yeah, that was where I started just because it's really easy and simple and it was just me and I could responsibly find a place that's on high ground, not near the water table, and dig a hole and it just composts. It just turns into soil. And I was very respectful and mindful about the environment and whoever was the landowner of the place I was at and communicating how that was managed. And I've done, quite a bit of research about how compost toilets function. And I think it's a great thing to kind of get your head around. It's really just the same as a compost pile in your garden with manure and different things being mixed. So, yeah, that was where it started. But then once I got to the final property in the northern New South Wales, Byron Hinterland, where I set up the Airbnb, I built a more substantial compost toilet, which mimicked what I'd seen working down in Victoria and commonly used with a lot of the natural building sites and communities that I visited. So it was using a big rubbish bin, like a Sulo bin, the ones that you put out in your curb. And essentially you modify them to have a screen at the bottom, maybe 6 inches or so up with mesh. So it needs to be hard so it can take weight, but then have like shade cloth or some different courses of mesh so it keeps the solids up, or the toilet paper and the waste above that, and the bottom can drain freely and take any excess liquid. And then you'd have a hose on the bottom that can disperse any excess liquid because if the compost toilet gets too wet, if it holds too much moisture, it goes anaerobic. There's not enough oxygen and it's not going to compost properly, and it can get really smelly. But with the one that's the standard model I was used to down in Victoria, and I took that, and what I did is I added a pee diverter. So the front third of your toilet had a plastic mold. You can search it online and find them that I think are $20. And the pee diverter takes it must be like 90% of the urine it kind of catches in the way that it's designed and positioned. And I was putting that into a separate, I think it was like a 44-gallon drum size plastic drum, and so I was splitting it, and that meant that I didn't have to be as worried about the moisture content when people wee in the toilet, and that meant that I didn't have to discard black water, because if you mix poo and wee you get black water. That's probably definitely more hazardous and has more more likely to hold pathogens, whereas urine on its own is sterile and it's not really a health risk. It might be a bit smelly, but if you dilute it with water at the right ratio, it's actually a really good nitrogen fertilizer on your garden. So that's the system I went for in terms of how I pieced it together, just adapting and adding a pea diverter to that basic wheelie bin compost toilet. And I think if you search Milkwood permaculture compost toilet online, you'll see a pretty good photographic guide as to how to put a wheelie bin compost toilet together. And it's not just them. A lot of people have documented that design, and I think it's a really good one. The catch is that if you need to get council or a state health department to sign off on it, each state handles the approval process for compost toilets in a different way. But I know that some of them are definitely not accepting of a homemade version of that wheelie bin. I know that there are commercial compost toilet systems that you can buy that basically mimic what I've just explained. But they're making them and getting them molded with all of those drainage functions, and the inside's obviously a bit different to your standard wheelie bin. That's already added when you buy it, and I know in WA there's certain designs like that are on the market that are pre-approved by the health department in WA, and that means you don't have to worry about it. So it depends on your situation, but it's the same system really that you can make at home or buy off the shelf. It's just a lot cheaper, obviously, to modify a wheelie bin yourself. So yeah, that's a bit of a breakdown in a nutshell, the compost toilet systems that I've dabbled with. And right now, unfortunately, the property we've moved on to had a small transportable building like a donga that we're living in, and that's on just a standard leach drain septic system. So we're using it for now, and it's not the best, but when time allows, I'm really looking forward to building a compost toilet here, and it'll be something very similar to what I had running in Byron Bay, probably using the Sulo bin, or if I need to tick some government boxes, probably consider getting a commercially available model. So we haven't got to the stage where we've had to make those decisions yet, but that's roughly what the system will look like that we'll put together here. I've had a really good experience in Byron. I was operating it in a way where it didn't smell, and part of it for me was because I was running it on Airbnb. It really had to function well and give people a positive experience. I wanted, a lot of my customers probably had never used a compost toilet before, and I was mindful of that, and I didn't want it to be one of those horrible experiences like when you're a kid and you go to a national park and use a long drop and it's dark and smelly and there's flies. So it was great to get something working so well, and I didn't get any bad reviews on Airbnb about my toilet, so I guess that says something.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I mean, it's not for everyone, is it? But I think that, I know for me, when I have my tiny house built, I definitely want to go that option, mainly for the eco-friendly type setup. So you mentioned that you built your own tiny home, you did a DIY build. And I'm just wondering, during that building process, what was one of the biggest struggles throughout that time, if any? Were there many mistakes made, or was there anything that was extremely challenging that you came up against during the build?
Look, it was all really challenging for me because I'd kind of cut my teeth on a few other tiny house building projects, but I was still learning. And so there was a lot of mistakes, especially because I got people to come to a workshop and learn building my house. So I kind of just had to shut up and let them make mistakes, and make sure that I went back over it and did some quality control if I knew something was a bit out, or just be aware that that's part of the deal when you go down the road of providing the build process as an educational learning experience for other people as well as yourself. I was very fortunate to be in that network of natural builders who provided really good mentorship and friendship and generosity in sharing their skills and knowledge with me. That made it a lot easier having people to go to when I get stuck. But to be honest, we're so connected to information these days with the internet. So if you really want to know how to do something and you know how to work a Google search, then, it's not too hard to watch a few YouTube videos and kind of figure it out. But you need to know where the line is, and there's certain things that need to be done properly for safety or for health reasons. And I guess it's a bit of a grey area, especially when you're doing it yourself, and you might dabble with some 12-volt electronics, let's just say, which is safe. But there's a line there where you get to a certain capacity in a solar system where it can be quite dangerous, and you can literally kill yourself if you don't know what you're doing, or you extend yourself a little bit too far. So I think identifying, knowing what you don't know, and identifying those gaps in your skill set or in your network skill set, and then knowing, okay, well, I need to do a bit of research and maybe get some quotes from people who do this professionally, because there's certain things that you need to get right, and could have quite significant consequences. And I guess solar systems, plumbing potentially, and just the trailer itself, the structural engineering of trailers and tiny houses are really heavy. That's a lot of weight to be towing on the road, and if something goes wrong and you crash it and you lose your house or someone dies, that's a reality. So yeah, that was probably one of the main challenges, just figuring out where that line was and what I could and couldn't do myself. And that's probably going to be different for everyone, depending on your skill set and the people you've got in your network.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier about how you found your parking space for your tiny home in Byron. Did you find that a relatively easy process? Like, did you have a lot of people come back to you when you were searching for it, or was it, did it take a long time? Was it fairly quick?
It was quick and easy. I was really surprised. Oh, well, I don't know if I was surprised, but I was heartened to get a positive response. I was optimistic about, hoping it would work out. I guess I'd been thinking about, I'd seen other people do it in terms of putting flyers up or Facebook posts. And so I had a fairly good idea about what I wanted to ask for, and how to, use an attractive photo and be very clear about what my boundaries were in terms of the places I wanted to be, the amount of money I was willing to pay. I think within 48 hours, I had a list of 30 properties within half an hour drive of Byron Bay. It was incredible. I didn't get to visit some of those. I just kind of picked the couple that were top of the list, and they all worked out. I was at 3 different properties. One of them was up behind Mullumbimby in Wilson's Creek on a beautiful farm a little bit further from the coast, and that was the first spot. The next was a bit closer to Byron, kind of near where the farm is, closer to the highway, in Ewingsdale, on a 1-acre property with beautiful gardens and avocado trees. And that was really lovely. It was nice being a bit closer to the action, and I'm a surfer, so I didn't have to drive as far to get to the beach. And then the third one ended up being the farm that was a bit further inland, but only about a 15-minute drive down to the beach, and it was just south of Byron. And the third one actually wasn't from the Facebook ad. That was just kind of social networks of friends of friends. Someone knew someone who had a property and might be interested, and that worked out for the third go. But it was really nice to kind of put it out there, be optimistic and hopeful. And a lot of people are really fearful, I think, of I see a lot of questions online of people that are contemplating tiny houses, and that might be a really significant barrier of feeling a bit daunted by that process of finding land. But I just kind of wish for the best and put it out there, and I had a really positive response. So I was very fortunate, but it was nice to have that choice, I guess, of being able to pick and choose a bit, just be really clear about what you're looking for. And if you've got a cute picture of your tiny house, it'll definitely help. That's my tip.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great, because I agree with you. I see a lot of people asking the same thing in a lot of the different Facebook groups. I mean, there's people advertising that they've got land, but there's also people asking if they know anyone that, who's willing to rent out for someone with a tiny home. And I guess if, the other options are if someone knows someone personally in their life and that's not an option, or if buying their own land is not an option, it's really nice to know that, if you just at least try and put it out there, you never know what you could find. And as an example, having around 30 offers, that's really definitely heartening to hear. Because I think I've heard of people as well coming up against that struggle, and then that kind of deterring them from even starting the process. And that'd be a shame, but that's really good to know. So thank you for that. And I'd just love to know as well, in terms of council regulations and for tiny houses, they're different in Australia, at least. They seem to be different depending on what state you're in. And then some councils are more friendly towards tiny houses and others are not. And I think it's a bit of a grey area. It's not so clear. But I'm just wondering, did you have any challenges in terms of council regulations when it came to parking your tiny house on land?
So in Australia, it seems that each state has a different set of regulations that apply to caravans, because legally speaking, a tiny house on wheels is a caravan under the general definitions. It's not a building because it's on wheels and it can be registered potentially. So I did my research in each of the states I was in terms of whether it was a state government framework that you had to deal with if you wanted to get approval, or whether it was delegated down to local government, because in some states they let local government make those local laws, and in other states like Western Australia we've got a set of caravan camping ground regulations and an act which are set at a state level, and the local government doesn't really have any chance to move on that. So it's not even a local government issue really. Well, they don't have an opportunity to override that state law. So to be honest with you, and I've run some tiny house workshops, and this is always something that comes up and it's good to cover. Most tiny houses in Australia at the moment that people are living in are probably flying under the radar, and they're not council approved, and they're not in accordance with the state regulations, if they're applicable in that state, in terms of caravans and camping grounds. I did a dissertation for my planning degree. Actually, it was the last kind of research paper, and I did it on tiny houses on wheels, and I did some surveys to building surveyors and planners in local governments in Western Australia, asking some questions. They all got asked the same set of questions about a tiny house on wheels scenario and how it might be approved. And I got different answers about the same legislation. So it is a grey area, and it's going to be a really challenging one, I think, to regulate well. There's not many examples out there, in Australia at least, that I'm aware of, where a local government or a state government has been proactive yet in regulating tiny house, and just acknowledging that people are choosing to live in tiny houses as a permanent housing option. It's different to a caravan. They last longer. They're generally built to a higher quality and spec that makes them obviously heavier and more wind resistant, and not as good to transport regularly like a caravan, which prioritizes being lightweight and more aerodynamic than a tiny house on wheels. So I think that's where the regulations historically have come from, that they're talking about caravans being a recreational vehicle that you use once in a blue moon. But things have changed, and I think it's the economic and social situation that we find ourselves in terms of just the cost of land and cost of living. People are strained, and that's meaning people who live in tiny houses make certain sacrifices, of comfort or lifestyle to then gain extra time or to lose some of the stress that goes with the burden of big houses and big mortgages. So hopefully the regulations catch up. It's hard to be optimistic, to be honest, without any good examples out there. But for now, it seems that people choosing to live in tiny houses are in a grey area, and they're often, if the neighbours don't complain, you don't get caught. So the advice I give is, find a secluded spot, and if the neighbours can see you, take them some scones and make friends, because if they make a phone call to the council, it could be all over. But that's the reality. It's hard to talk about, and I work in planning for the government, so I've got I'm in an interesting space, but, just speaking honestly about it, this is the current situation, and it's not unique to Australia. I think in America and around the world, we're finding the same thing. These regulatory frameworks that have been developed for housing and for caravanning, running in parallel or sometimes joined. Tiny houses aren't really fitting in very well, and people are just doing it because of necessity or for whatever reason they make those decisions. So that deters a lot of people, because you might not be able to get insurance, and if your neighbour dobs on you, you might get kicked off that bit of land and have to find somewhere else. And so you've got to be okay with that risk and understand the parameters, I guess, to make an informed decision. And, if you are going to make a decision like that and live in a tiny house, you just want to be confident that you're not hurting anyone, you're not polluting the environment. It's good to do it responsibly, but in terms of regulations and approvals, that's a really tough space. And it's generally the examples out there are when someone does get caught and then the council tries to evict them, or the state government plays hardball, and then people have been, I think in Brisbane, there was an example where someone made an appeal and was successful, and they were allowed to keep living in a tiny house in a backyard. But there are different frameworks in each state, so one doesn't necessarily transfer to the other.
There is a difference as well between a tiny house on wheels and if it's a fixed foundation on the land, right? So what I've researched in terms of New South Wales, at least, and I think maybe Queensland, and it could be the same elsewhere, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe you can correct me on this. If you're in a tiny house on wheels, which you said is classed as a caravan, that supposedly you can only live in it for like 150 days in a year or something like that. I don't know if it's like 3 days in a week. And there are some people that are doing that under the radar, as you said. And I don't know. I feel like in the last couple of years, especially with everything that's going on, that the tiny house movement here in Australia has grown quite a lot. And I'm seeing tiny building companies, like actual professional building companies, have like longer wait lists and those types of things too. And so I'm hopeful that, the more demand that there is for this and the more people that are looking into this option for their way of living, that hopefully there will be some more talk on this and some more clarity, and maybe we'll see what happens with that.
I think it's a good point you raise. If you are fixing them to a foundation and taking them off their wheels, or building them from the get-go just without the wheels and putting them on stumps or a pad or whatever it is you're putting it on, fixing it to the ground, there is a pathway there through the building codes to get it approved as a dwelling, a house. The challenges come, I guess, where the minimum standards for a house have certain requirements that kind of can conflict with tiny houses quite easily, like having a separate sink for your bathroom, a separate sink for your laundry, and a separate sink for your kitchen. Often in a tiny house, you've got one or two, not three. With the loft, you've got minimum ceiling heights, so we're not living in cramped, small conditions in our housing. But often in tiny houses, if you do have a bedroom loft, the ceiling height might be lower than it's permitted to be under the building code. And the other one is probably the stairs up to a loft probably won't comply. Some will, but if you're using a ladder to get up to your loft, or it's a steep set of stairs, it's probably not going to comply with the Australian building codes in terms of that ladder access or staircase. So there's some of the common challenges in terms of tiny houses and the building code if you do go that route. And it's not to say it's not possible, but then you start paying building inspectors and officers, and it can cost a bit of money, and generally people who are building tiny houses on wheels don't have heaps of money to throw around. So that's another bit of a risk, I guess, navigating a regulatory process where you don't know at the start what it might cost you, because you're not necessarily able to meet all of the regulations how they're intended. You might be using performance criteria to come up with an alternative solution, and that just adds an extra cost in terms of paying a consultant to help you through that process. That's at least how it works in WA. But again, there's probably nuances of how different states kind of structure their building processes a bit differently. But when I have interviewed a few building surveyors as part of that university research I did for my dissertation, that was kind of what they indicated at the time. And at the moment, I'm working for a local government, and I've got a good relationship with the building surveyor, and we have some really fascinating conversations about this stuff in terms of how tiny houses and tiny houses on wheels fit in or don't fit in with different regulations in both planning and building. So, it's a fascinating space, but there's no easy answers at this time.
Yeah, definitely. And so something else that I thought about as you were talking was, because we're talking mostly, I think, about DIY builds, but many of the different tiny house building companies out there, at least definitely the one that I'm going to be using, so Designer Eco Tiny Homes in New South Wales, They build to the standards of a caravan in terms of weight and in terms of size. And I know that, many of the other ones out there are doing that as well. And I guess if that's an option for people, like it's obviously a more expensive option than doing it yourself. But it's also good to know that there are companies out there doing it, trying to do the right thing, or at least doing it in the framework of a caravan. But yeah, as we were saying before, it's the length of living in the space full time and all of that is up in the air too. But you mentioned before about insurance, and I'm just wondering, like, do you have any recommendations for that, or what did you do for your home previously?
So with insurance, the only insurance I had was public liability insurance to cover me in the event of someone getting injured when they were staying in the tiny house through Airbnb. And the company I went through was Youi, Youi. They're an Australian insurance company, and I'd had them recommended by someone else who was running a small business in the natural building community in Victoria. So I had really positive experiences with them, and that was public liability business insurance. I don't know how you'd go in terms of insuring, your tiny house as a caravan or a building. You'd have to give them a call. I guess because I built my house the DIY route at very low cost. I took a risk by not having insurance in terms of when I was transporting or living in it. If, say, there'd been a fire or a natural disaster or a car crash, I'm sure, because I did register my tiny house to drive on the road, I would have been covered for third-party insurance had there been an accident on the road. But in terms of, home insurance or contents insurance, I didn't have anything like that.
Yeah, that's really good to know. I'm also wondering, so kind of going back to your tiny houses in Byron, but even now you talk about you're living in a donga. And I'm just wondering, is there anything maybe unexpectedly or not unexpectedly challenging about living in small spaces? And maybe what are some of the challenges you've experienced?
It's definitely a different way of living and being. And I think before I built my first tiny house, I'd gone through a couple of years where I'd been a bit more transient. I guess packed up a big rental house I had with some friends, a share house in Fremantle in WA, and spent a few years kind of living with friends or family friends or, moving into state. So I naturally went through a process of putting some things in storage and prioritizing the items and the bits of clothes that I needed with me. And I was essentially living out of a suitcase. So it made it quite easy. I can imagine if you're living in a large house and then you suddenly build or have built a tiny house that you want to move into, it's going to be a lot of work of prioritizing what makes the cut and what you have to let go of and sell or put in storage. I think tiny house, big shed is a bit of a motto of mine now because, I think I'm going to keep pursuing carpentry and building. And that means I've got a lot of tools and I've also got a lot of timber that I hoard for when I need it. So I think just the reality of life is, it's really hard to fit everything in a tiny house on wheels, especially when it's as small as the one I built. And there are things you don't want in your house you need in the workshop or the shed. So I think the other side of that is even when you have made those decisions and you've culled your things and you've got them all in the tiny house in their place, any clutter or mess stands out because you have limited bench space or table space. So that's certainly a bit of a challenge that I've faced, and I probably go through waves of living like a bit of a pig and then cleaning it all up for Airbnb or when I've got guests or when my partner gets on my case, which is fair enough because I'm a bit more of a slob than her. But, that's just exaggerated in a small space because, there's just lack of room to hide that mess.
Yeah, I guess that's just like anything in life, always going to come up against little challenges, or if you're put into a situation where, you're living in a different way or out of your comfort zone or something that's not so familiar, then there's always going to be this way of needing to adapt. Is there anything that you would do differently with your tiny house build?
I think one big lesson I've learnt is how important the trailer base is. Because I was doing it on a really tight budget, I kind of cheaped out and used a recycled caravan chassis. I was not wanting to be in a situation where I had safety concerns about that not being strong enough. So it kind of meant that I skimped on the initial purchase of the trailer. I think it literally cost me $350 for a single axle caravan trailer. But then through the journey of building the house and figuring out what modifications I had to do to the trailer to make it safe and compliant, I probably had to spend a bit of extra money and time problem solving and getting engineers and trailer professionals to replace components and to beef up the structural base so that it was strong enough to put the weight that I was going to build onto it. So I think it's a really important point for people to just be realistic from the start about the weight that your tiny house is going to kind of come in at when it's finished and loaded with all of your stuff, and making sure that the structure itself, the axles, the brakes, the tires, the bearings, everything has to be rated accordingly so that you don't come unstuck when you're on the road moving at 100 Ks or however fast you're going with your tiny house. It's a very nerve-wracking experience when you first move a tiny house. I think a lot of people have that feeling when they see their tiny house on the road, or it's coming close to low-hanging branches in driveways. It's pretty nerve-wracking because there's so much at stake. So for me, that was the biggest takeaway. And if the next build I did use another recycled caravan chassis, but I got a much chunkier, better rated kind of later model one. And I guess with my builds, I have been at the smaller end of the scale in terms of weight and size. And I've made sure that all of the timbers I've used have been pine or cedar, kind of light woods to minimize the weight. Yeah, that's one of the challenges when you're doing it low cost, because it can be a big outlay to get a big double or triple axle trailer fabricated as a custom. For some people, it might be better to not have it on wheels. If you can, get access to land and build it on stumps, you can take maybe 10 grand off the build cost. But everyone's situation's different, so there's probably no one fits all.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners today, just as we wrap up the conversation?
I think I'd encourage people to have a crack. Like, if you've never picked up a hammer or a drill, start small, build a table out of an old pallet or a chicken coop or something really easy that if you stuff up, it doesn't matter. There's nothing at stake, and kind of ease your way in. That was my trajectory anyway, in terms of building confidence with hand tools and construction methods, because, I came from a background where I didn't have those skills and had to learn. And for some people, you might kind of go through that process in your mind and decide that it's not for you and you'd rather outsource that to someone else. And that's fine. You don't have to do it yourself, or you can do little bits of it yourself and get other people to come and fill those gaps. So I think just being realistic about what you can and can't do. And if you do want to kind of jump in the deep end, ease your way in, maybe help someone else on their project, volunteer for someone if you know a carpenter, and, do someone else's project, build a patio or something like that with someone who's qualified and knowledgeable. And then that'll give you a bit of a realistic taste for what it's like, because there is a lot to learn in terms of carpentry and all of the other trades which go into building a house.
Oh, that's great. I was thinking about this probably a couple of weeks ago, because as I mentioned before, I'm going to have my tiny house built by a building company, but I also want to have a hand in, something to do with the process of my home, and thinking maybe I could start small and build a deck or a shed, as you talked about before, or something like that. And I think that's really good advice, is starting small, start where you are. And yeah, I think that's going to be really helpful for people. So, and I'll link to everything in the show notes that we've mentioned today, just so if anyone wants to check those out, they'll be available in the episode show notes on tinyhouseconversations.com. And where can people find you online, Emmet?
So I've got a website set up, which is thewoodbutcherstinyhouse.com. There's not a whole lot on there at the moment. That's where I was kind of giving out information about upcoming events when I was running some workshops, and also had some information and links for my Airbnb operation. There's nothing happening terms of that stuff at the moment. But there's some photos and some links to a couple of videos that have been, I think you mentioned that, the documentary that's on YouTube, A Simpler Way, is up there, and also a tour of my tiny house with Bryce and Russa from Living Big in a Tiny House. So, yeah, that's probably the best way. And there's some links to social media as well. I've been a little inactive for a while, but I suspect it will ramp up in the next couple of years once I get my tiny house back from the East Coast and we start doing a bit more here on the property in WA.
Perfect. And I'll also link to all your details in the show notes as well. And, Emmet, thanks so much for taking the time today, for sharing your stories and experiences. I think it's going to be really helpful for a lot of people.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For sure. And if you're listening to this episode, thanks for taking the time to hang out with us. Make sure you go check out Emmet online. And if you want more Tiny House Conversations, I release new episodes every Thursday. So if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the latest episode is live. I'll see you in the next session. Hey, Tiny Lifers, thanks so much for listening. And before you go, one of the best ways to support this podcast is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more valuable tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So make sure you head over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this episode and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thanks so much in advance. I appreciate you, and see you in the next session.